I'm pleased to introduce our writer for today, Litwack, who is Professor of History on the Berkeley campus. Professor Litwack is a true alumnus of Berkeley. He received his BA, MA, PhD all from Berkeley and has been teaching on the Berkeley campus since 1967. He received the Pulitzer Prize in History as well as the American Book Award in History for his book, which is a well-known work, Been in the Storm So Long, The Aftermath of Slavery, that was published in 1979. He has also published numerous articles and books, including the most recent book, Trouble in Mind, Black Southerners in the Age of Jim Crow, that was in 1998. I should also add that Professor Litwack is not only a distinguished historian and writer, but an excellent teacher. He has been the recipient of the Distinguished Teaching Award, as well as other awards on campus for his excellence in teaching. Now, joining him today as interviewer is Maggie Sokolik, who received her PhD in Applied Linguistics from UCLA. She has been teaching writing since 1987 and is the author of several textbooks on reading and writing, as well as works on American culture, including her book on Rethinking America. Professor Litwack will now read briefly from his writings, and Maggie will join him and continue with some questions for Professor Litwack. So, Professor Litwack.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Noon hour at that. I don't have too many deep, dark secrets about writing to reveal, which is what I told Steve when he first asked me to come to this program. Ernest Hemingway once said that the best way for a writer to learn his craft is to go away and write. And since Hemingway was one of my boyhood idols, especially for his short stories, I believed him. So when asked to participate in the Writers at Work series, I thought my contribution could actually be quite brief. I learned to write by writing. But of course, how I write is inseparable from why I write. What drew me to history, what drew me to writing, even as a child, were the stories. The stories I read, the stories I heard, the stories my parents told me about coming to the United States from Russia and then finding their way out to California from New York City, hitchhiking much of the way. But also the stories I heard growing up in Santa Barbara's, I guess you can almost call it the barrio, around Milpas and Alphonse. Stories that I heard from my neighbors, Mexican, mostly Mexican, but some Greek and Italian immigrant families. But those stories had no place in the history courses that were taught in my high school and junior high school. You know, we learned about pilgrims, Puritans, founding fathers, presidents. It seemed almost like someone else's history. Where were my people? Where were the neighbors? Where were their stories? Were they not a part of the nation's history? Well, their stories were nowhere to be found. My parents had no formal education. My father worked as a gardener, my mother as a seamstress, but they were very learned people. And early on, they introduced me to a cultural world that helped to shape my writing, thinking, reading, and listening. They spoke often of the people they most admired, many of them well known: Henry David Thoreau, Walt Whitman, Tolstoy, Gandhi, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Beethoven, Tchaikovsky, Verdi. Many of them less known: rebels and dissidents, Eugene Debs, Big Bill Haywood, Emma Goldman. Men and women who had engaged themselves in the struggles for social justice. My neighborhood exposed me at the same time to a diversity of cultures, languages, and histories. I thought it a unique, exciting, even exhilarating experience, a learning experience. I learned as much out of school as I learned in school. One advantage of living in Santa Barbara is that there was little else to do but read. So I learned to write by reading. I was exposed many times to what Alfred Kazin has called the raw, hurting power that a book can have over a person. And for me in my high school years, it was John Dos Passos, Theodore Dreiser, Ernest Hemingway, Langston Hughes, Richard Wright, Jack London, Mark Twain, John Steinbeck, and James T. Farrell for his Duslonigan trilogy. What I wrote, even my short stories, reflected my reading, but also my politics, my worldview. In my senior year in high school, I edited the school newspaper, only to find myself embroiled in a running conflict with the vice principal, who several times wanted to shut the paper down over editorials and stories he deemed obscene and subversive. Well, actually, they were. He was right. We called for the removal of the Reader's Digest from English classes, where it was used to build vocabulary. We called for the abolition of the ROTC, and we thought the funds expended each year to commemorate the old Spanish days in Santa Barbara would be better spent on low-cost housing for Mexican Americans. And in a special issue on Brotherhood Week, we focused on the persistence and virulence of racism in American society. A somewhat unusual high school newspaper. When I came to Berkeley as an undergraduate, my writing continued unabated, most of it informed by my interest in the history of Black Americans and history of working people. This time I had more readers and critics. Some of my stories regrettably fell into the hands of the wrong reader, my landlady, and they ended up somehow in Army intelligence and FBI files. But I managed to preserve the story written for George Stewart's long narrative course in the English department about a strike of nurses, aides, and orderlies at Herrick Hospital, a strike in which I'd been an observer and also participant. That characterized the writing to which I remained committed, from the Herrick Hospital strike to the organization of the ILWU, to the tensions between black and white workers in the 19th century, to my dissertation and first book, North of Slavery, Free Blacks in the North from 1790 to 1860, and then finally to this ongoing trilogy on the experience of black Southerners, starting with Been in the Storm So Long, Trouble in Mind, and one that's in progress. My interest in history remains focused on stories, on voices long stifled, peoples once marginalized. And I found that to bring to historical consciousness people left outside the framework of the American experience, that is, to probe inner lives and experiences once thought to be unreclaimable, required a sensitivity to the varieties of historical expression, to sources historians had seldom considered using, the ways, for example, in which photographs, art, music, dance, folklore, film may illuminate the range and the depth of the human experience, their value as cultural records, as interpretive documents. To explore these rich archives is, in the words of my esteemed colleague Larry Levine, to enter a world in which the spoken, chanted, sung, or shouted word is often the primary form of communication. I have learned nearly as much from novelists, poets, musicians, storytellers, and artists as I have from historians. They have illuminated the past for me in ways that are difficult for the historian to capture. The poetry of a Sterling Brown or Langston Hughes, the prose of a Gene Toomer, a Ralph Ellison, a Richard Wright, a Zora Neale Hurston, a Toni Morrison, the photographs of a P.J. Polk or a James Van Der Zee, the artistry of Aaron Douglas, Jacob Lawrence, Romare Bearden. And as critical as any of these artists, the eloquent matter-of-factness, the frightening honesty conveyed by the blues men and blues women. It has been said that some of the most spirited, some of the bleakest and most anguished non-fiction in the American idiom may be found in their work. In the toughness, the tensions, the passion, the wisdom and wit, the immediacy of a Charlie Patton, a Robert Johnson, a Son House, a Tommy Johnson, a Ma Rainey, a Muddy Waters. Names strangely and conspicuously absent from almost all anthologies of American literature and American poetry. In his book, Deep Blues, Robert Palmer asks, how much thought can be hidden in a few short lines of poetry? How much history can be transmitted by pressure on a guitar string? And he answers, the thought of generations, the history of every human being who's ever felt the blues come down like showers of rain. That's the spirit that I think informs my writing. I hope it is. I'm fortunate, as a historian of the African American experience, to have access to some extraordinary sources. The challenge is simply to do justice to those sources, to the richness, to the eloquence of those sources. My writing is not aimed at an academic audience. I want to write clearly, in readable, unspecialized prose, uncluttered by some of the trendy, jargon-ridden prose that has inflicted itself on some of the academy. I confess to being an ideologue, a captive of what one critic has called the ideology of lucidity. The challenge is to engage the reader, to captivate, even if possible, enthrall the reader. Catherine Drinker Bowen kept a sign posted on her desk, will the reader turn the page? I also think of W.H. Auden's admonition, thou shalt not sit with statisticians nor commit a social science. I want my readers to hear and feel the voices. I want them to feel the past in ways that might be genuinely disturbing. I want them to feel those blues coming down like showers of rain. And I'm going to read a few passages now from, starting with Been in the Storm So Long. It's hard to read, or it's hard to select passages because you look at the passage and you think about using it, but you also think about rewriting it. And you have to kind of control yourself. I'm using this one to start with because it's the opening of Been in the Storm So Long, hopefully setting the mood, and also because I think first sentences and first paragraphs are very important. Robert Murray could already sense the change in his white folks. As a young slave, dividing his time between running errands and tending the horses, he'd been treated tolerably well. Massa had been generous in providing food and clothing. Mrs. had ignored both law and custom to teach several of the slaves to read, and the slave children had usually found a warm welcome in the big house. Been treat us like we's one of the family, Murray recalled, just so we treat the white folks respectable and work hard. After the election of Abraham Lincoln, however, it all different. The easy familiarity of the master and mistress gave way to suspicious glances, and the slaves were permitted less freedom of movement around the place. When the children ventured up to the big house, as they had done so often in the past, the master or mistress now barred their way and offered excuses for not inviting them inside. Don't go in the big house no more, children, Robert Murray's mother advised them. I know what the trouble is. They suppose we all wants to be free. To endure, perhaps even to survive, many slaves had learned from experience to anticipate the white man's moods and whims, to know his expectations, to placate his fears, to flatter his vanity, and to feed his feelings of superiority. As a slave, Henry Bibb recalled he had come to realize the folly of openly resisting the white man. The only weapon of self-defense that I could use successfully was that of deception. With considerable relish, a former Tennessee slave remembered the death of a particularly cruel mistress. The slaves on the plantation did what was expected of them when one of their white folks died. They solemnly filed into the big house to pay their final respects, covering their faces with their hands as if to hide their tears and stifle their sobs. Once they were outside, however, the slaves made their feelings known to each other. "Old goddamn son of a bitch," one of them murmured, "she's gone on down to hell." The war revealed, often in ways that defy description, the sheer complexity of the master-slave relationship and the conflicts, contradictions, and ambivalence that relationship generated in each individual. The slave's emotions and behavior invariably rested on a precarious balance between the habit of obedience and the intense desire for freedom. The same humble, self-effacing slave who touched his hat to his white folks was capable of touching off the fire that gutted his master's house. The loyal body servant who risked his life to carry his wounded master to safety remounted his master's horse and fled to the Yankees. The black boatman lionized by the Richmond press for his denunciation of the Yankees and enlistment as a Confederate recruit deserted to the Union lines with valuable information and 20 new rebel uniforms. The house slave who nursed her mistress through a terrible illness, always evincing love and affection, even weeping over her condition, deserted her when the moment seemed right. When I was scarce able to walk without assistance, she left me without provocation or reason, left me in the night, and that too without the slightest noise. On a plantation in South Carolina, an elderly black woman known as Aunt Phyllis told how her master had built his new house only a year before the outbreak of the Civil War. Like those slaves who habitually boasted of the wealth of their white folks, she dwelled on the fact that her master had paid a great deal of money for this house, as much as $20,000. "Where did your master get so much money?" a northern journalist asked the old woman. The question obviously agitated her. Although confined to bed because of an illness, she managed to raise herself up, and with considerable excitement in her voice, she kept repeating the question. "Where he get his money? Where he get his money? Is that what you ask? Where he get his money? I show you, massa." Pushing up her sleeve, she revealed a gaunt, skinny arm. Tapping it vigorously with her forefinger, she exclaimed, "You see that, massa? That's where he got his money. Out of that black skin, he got his money." From Trouble in Mind. The boll weevil made no distinctions based on race or class, destroying white and black farmers, large and small. Ned Cobb's fascination with the insect suggested a certain admiration. As he said, everything God creates, he created for a purpose. And if that purpose included the destruction of white fortunes, some black farmers felt a grudging sympathy for an insect that could render white men powerless, that could exert controls over white men that they could not. They were proud and selfish people, these plantation owners, Mahalia Jackson recalled, and I believe that God finally sent the boll weevil to jumble them. Thanks to the boll weevil, a lot of these thieving plantation people died out too. Even the cries of dismay often took the form of respectful conversation between the black man and his uninvited cotton-consuming guest. with the black farmer wondering why the insect should wipe out people already overburdened and victimized. Now, Mr. Boll Weevil, if you talk, why don't you tell? Now, Mr. Boll Weevil, if you talk, why don't you tell? Say, you see, poor Kokomo down here in Georgia is catching a lot of hell. When Ned Cobb recalled that all God's dangers ain't a white man, he had the Boll Weevil in mind. Actually, both antagonists displayed aggressive appetites and the capacity to destroy black aspirations and to cheat blacks out of the products of their labor. Don't you know how them creatures have done me wrong? Boll Weevil got my cotton, and the merchant got my corn. What shall I do? What shall I do? But the Boll Weevil was no match for the white man's rapaciousness. What the Boll Weevil can do to me, Cobb reflected, ain't half as bad as to what a man might do. I can go to my field and shake a poison dust on my crop, and the Boll Weevil will sail away. But how can I sling a man off my back? The question took on a real urgency in the 1890s and the early 20th century, when white Southerners, faced with the specter of a new Negro, moved on every front to make certain that their assumptions about black inferiority went unchallenged. Boll Weevil in the cotton, cutworm in the corn, devil in the white man. What's going on? Some 75 years after the Civil War, two white women approached a small house on Camp Street in New Orleans. They had been told it was the home of Mary Harris, an elderly black woman who had once been a slave on a sugar plantation in Louisiana, and who might be willing to share her memories of those days for an oral history project. Sure, I remember slavery times, she said. I was a big girl, turned 11. I used to pull the fan that kept the flies off the white folks while they were eating. It wasn't hard work, but my arms became tired, especially at dinner when they sat so long at the table. She had never been whipped, she said, because she had performed her tasks and knew never to talk back to white people. Her mother, however, had felt the lash more than once, and the experience had left a lasting impact. My mom told me she was brutally beaten, and she was bitter all her life. The two white women returned the next day to resume the interview. This time they found Mary Harris's son barring their way. Slavery, he exclaimed. Why are you concerned about that stuff? It's bad enough for it to have existed, and what we can't forget, there's no need of rehashing it. The women tried to explain to him that they only wanted to preserve the reminiscences of former slaves about the Old South, slavery, and the Civil War, and that the mother possessed a marvelous memory of those times. That same marvelous memory, the son retorted, had filled him with bitterness and anger. He reminded them of the stories of brutality and abuse he had heard from his mother. The visitors replied that all slaveholders had not behaved in that way. Slavery, they said, had an unfortunate side, they agreed, and they had conceded as much to his mother the previous day. But the two women took pride in the fact that old slaves can tell of their love for the old massa and old miss, and the loyalty and the love existing between them could never have been created in raucous hearts. The son remained unmoved, and he did not hesitate to reveal his own feelings about the pain and the legacy he had inherited. Yes'm, I'm bitter, and the more I think about it, the madder I get. Look at me. They say I could pass for white. My mother is bright, too. And why? Because the man who owned and sold my mother was her father. But that's not all. The man I hate with every fiber of my body. And why? Because a brute like that, who, when he can sell his own child, into unprincipled hands, is a beast. The power, just because he had the power and the thirst for money. Having made his point, the son relented and agreed to let the two women meet his mother again. But they had had enough. The son's remarks had badly shaken them, and they preferred to leave rather than resume the interview. After such a tirade, we were afraid, deciding that discretion was the better part of valor. It was our first experience with a madman. What was strikingly new and different in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was the sadism and exhibitionism that characterized white violence. The ordinary modes of execution and punishment were deemed insufficient. They no longer satisfied the emotional appetite of the crowd. To kill the victim was not enough. The execution had to be turned into a public ritual, a collective experience. And the victim needed to be subjected to an extraordinary torture and mutilation. What had been in the past a usually rapid disposal of the victim now became part of a voyeuristic spectacle, prolonged as long as possible, once for 7 hours, for the benefit of the crowd. Nor were whites content after the victim had died. In some instances, they continued to pump bullets into the body, after which they carved him up with knives or burned him to a crisp. Or they might permit the body to dangle by the rope for the next several days as a warning to the black community. The story of a lynching, then, is more than the simple fact of a black man or woman hanged by the neck. It is a story of slow, methodical, sadistic, often highly inventive forms of torture and mutilation. If executed by fire, it is the red-hot poker applied to the eyes and genitals, and the stench of burning flesh as the body slowly roasts over the flames and the blood sizzles in the heat. If executed by hanging, it is the convulsive movement of the limbs. Whether by fire or rope, it is the dismemberment and distribution of severed bodily parts as favors and souvenirs to participants in the crowd. Teeth, ears, toes, fingers, nails, kneecaps, bits of charred skin and bones. Such human trophies might reappear as watch fobs or be displayed prominently in public viewing. The severed knuckles of Sam Hose, for example, would be prominently displayed in the window of a grocery store in Atlanta. If most black Southerners accommodated, they did so from a sense of limited options, not because they placed any credence in the tenets of their white superiority. But they did not necessarily submit, nor did they necessarily internalize the white man's image of them and accept subordination as a permanent condition. The difference between accommodation and submission may have been quite subtle, but it marked the line black people drew between themselves and white people, and for many blacks, defined the terms of survival. Like many others, young Richard Wright learned to curb his impulses, speech, expression, and manner. But there had to be limits, he came to believe, and if he was to retain any semblance of self-respect. Whatever the expectations of the whites he encountered, whatever the requirements of the occasion, he confessed his inability to accommodate to every white whim. I could not help it. I could not grin. Alias Brown, the High Sheriff of Jefferson County, Alabama, achieved a reputation in the late 19th century for ruthlessness and efficiency. His claim to distinction rested largely on the remarkable white horse he rode, and the stories about that horse's powers reverberated through black Birmingham and in the countryside. The sheriff reportedly never had to shoot at a fleeing black man. He only needed to get down from the horse and let this extraordinary animal pursue him. He would set out after that black fugitive, as it said, like a hound dog after a rabbit, and quickly overtake him, then clasp the fugitive's arms in his teeth and return him to Sheriff Brown. In the early days, in the early 1890s, in the pipe works at Bessemer, only a few miles from Birmingham, black laborers sang, "Here comes Alias Brown, lady, baby. Here comes Alias Brown, riding after me, riding after me, riding after me. Here comes Alias Brown, riding after me. I'm going back to Birmingham." Some 40 years later, from the Mississippi Delta, as if to suggest how little had changed, bluesman Robert Johnson articulated a lonely and terrifying sense of personal betrayal and anguish that transcended both time and location. With a chilling and relentless matter-of-factness, he suggested a society impossible to change or overcome. He suggested, too, a new generation of interior exiles like himself, exiles in their own land. Even as the black Southerners struggled to achieve some semblance of dignity, to hang on to a self-esteem, the dominant society seemed intent on denying him his very identity, his very humanity. And like Alias Brown's remarkable white horse, it pursued him relentlessly, latched onto him, and refused to let go. I gotta keep moving, I gotta keep moving. Blues falling down like hail, blues falling down like hail. Oh, blues falling down like hail, blues falling down like hail. And the days keeps on reminding me, there's a hellhound on my trail, a hellhound on my trail, a hellhound on my trail.
Okay, we have a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to launch right into questions here and hope to get to a number of them. There's so much material to talk about here. But I thought we'd just start, if you could just walk us through a typical writing day or writing session. What's it like? Where are you writing? What's going on around you?
Well, can people hear me? Not yet. Oh, where do I put this?
I think they got it.
Up here? Now? Okay, yeah. I'm not a very disciplined writer. I mean, I've heard people tell me that they write every morning from 6 to 12 or 6 to 10, and that's it. I don't really work that way. My best hours for writing have always been from 12 to 12, which means from 12 midnight to 12 noon. I'm a morning person, and and I don't require that much sleep. So that's when I do my work, and I work best with musical accompaniment. The music depends pretty much on my mood and what I'm writing. In the wee hours of the morning, of course, it's likely to be some Miles Davis and perhaps some Coltrane, or maybe some late Beethoven quartets. But the music varies. But I always try to have music on, and I find it very inspirational. So it might be Beethoven is inspiring one moment, and it might be Guns N' Roses inspiring me another moment. I play them all. And of course the blues people, the jazz people, classical, I use it all. And again, it pretty much depends on how I'm feeling and what I'm writing. So, but that's pretty much all there is to it. I do write still write often in longhand in a notebook, and then transcribe that onto the computer. And that's an interesting process, because as you're transcribing it onto the computer, of course, it's already changing quite rapidly. But that's it. I don't, and some days are better than other days, but it can be
sometimes agonizing, but I really find, for the most part, writing is exhilarating. I also find it interesting, I find it valuable to read my writing aloud. I want to be aware of the rhythm. I hope there's a rhythm in the writing, and the rhythm of the words and the sound of the words. I want to hear them. So I find that very useful.
Well, the type of writing you do seems to require a lot of organizational skills. I mean, there's a lot of primary sources, a lot of voices to keep track of. And so how do you kind of attack that monumental job of organizing your sources?
Well, it's pretty simple, really. Sorry.
No, it's encouraging to hear.
I use half sheets, and on top of the half sheet, I'll put down what the subject matter is, or where it fits into my outline. I do start with an outline. I do work from an outline, and the outline keeps changing, of course, as it should. But the notes are filed according to the outline. One of the nice things about the computer is that if you put the notes on a computer, then you can make 4 or 5 copies of the same document, because they may apply to 4 or 5 different sections of your manuscript. But I think so. For me, the outline becomes very important.
Well,
The sources are, I'm also very privileged to have a remarkable library. I've been a book collector since I was in high school, actually, and when I was collecting Langston Hughes for 50 cents at the local bookstores. Thank God I was getting them then. So I have most of the books I need right in my study. And of course the sources, which I have found primarily by research in the South. I've used the Schomburg in Harlem, but most of my research has been focused in places like the North Carolina libraries and University of Mississippi. State archives are very valuable to me, so I look at the state archives in Alabama, Georgia, in as many states as I can get to. And as I said in the talk, the sources are there. To me, they're terribly rich, especially some of the oral history that I've been getting into at the Duke University Oral History program are very valuable to me. And the sources can be overpowering because they're so, as I said, they're so rich and they're so exciting. And that's what makes writing so exhilarating, is to try to, when you feel when you feel you've done justice to those sources.
Well, you alluded to the revision process a little bit, from the process of moving from the handwritten page to the computer. And in the preface of one of your books, you thanked, as writers often do, a number of people, but you thanked them for their sharp criticism of your work and their help in reducing the size of your manuscripts. How do you, some people don't take criticism easily and aren't so charitable about thanking people. How do you get helpful feedback on your work?
Well, okay. I'm very grateful to my critics. I do listen to them, and I do act on their suggestions. Sometimes I disagree with my editors, for example, but for the most part, I find their criticism quite valuable. And I always have made a point too of having my manuscript read by several of my non-academic friends. I want to make sure that everything is comprehensible and understandable to someone who's not an academician, who's not a historian, and I think that's very important. I've always had to do a lot of cutting. If you've looked at my volumes, they're rather large volumes, and they could have been much larger if they had not been cut. So cutting is agonizing. It hurts. You can almost cry. But sometimes when you have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 examples of the same point, you simply have to find illustrations to cut, and that really does hurt. But I have good news for you. I keep my cuts. And I preserve the cuts, and some years later, after I've done a book, I'll go back and look at what I cut. And I look at them, and I say, yeah, they should have been cut. So even the ones that were the most agonizing cuts to make, I think was precisely what needed to be removed.
So back to a little biographical information. The book, The American Labor Movement, has a publication date of '62 on it, and North of Slavery is '61. Sort of seemingly two different topics, and you must have been working on them somewhat simultaneously. Which of those actually did you write first, and how did you make the transition from the interest in labor to the interest in slavery and post-slavery?
Okay. Well, the transition from being interested in the history of the working class to being interested in black Americans is not a major transition. I was always interested in labor because my own parents were workers. My mother had worked in garment factories in New York before she hitchhiked out to California. I was very much a pro-union person. In fact, when I was in high school, I asked my high school teacher for permission to respond to the textbook on slavery and Reconstruction, because I'd done a lot of reading and I decided the textbook was all wrong. So the teacher graciously gave me 50 minutes class time, 11th grade, to respond to the textbook. And I went off to the public library in Santa Barbara and checked out W.E.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction. I read it and I prepared my report, and it was irrefutable. It was absolutely irrefutable. The textbook was wrong, and this is why the textbook was wrong. No question about it. I finished my report, ready to savor my triumph, and the teacher looked at the class. She said, "Now, class, you must remember, Leon is bitterly pro-labor." Well, yeah, but I wondered, what did that have to do with what I've just said? And I realized somewhere along the way that, yes, she was trying to tell the students that my very pronounced views about labor and unions somehow colored my views of other subjects as well, so I had to be treated with great care. But I'd already been hooked, and I'd been hooked in terms of labor history, in terms of black history. Also, when I at Berkeley, I spent a summer and Christmas vacation one time, and I wanted to do it for a long period of time, but I got married instead, shipping out, that is catching freighters in San Francisco and going out to, I had not been out of the state of California, but I had been to Manila and Tokyo and Japan, Hong Kong. That is, I hadn't been out of the state of California going east, but I'd certainly gone the other direction. And that was a marvelous experience. It was something I had coveted from the time I was growing up in Santa Barbara. And I read all the books about the sea. Dana, Jack London, many. And I thought that would be fabulous, and it was fabulous. So I went out as a mess boy on the President McKinley, American President Lines. The mess boy is the lowest of the staff, but I was making more money than I'd ever made in my life because we had a good union. The Marine Cooks and Stewards Union. And that was a wonderful group of people. The crew was about, the messman crew was about, the kitchen crew, messman crew was about, 80% black and about 20% Filipino. And of course we were just all very good friends. We went out on the ports together. I liked the ship so much that when I came back to school, because I really felt I had to go back to school, and they thought I should go back to school too, when the ship would come in, I'd look at the Chronicle and see, the McKinley's coming into port. And since the crew stayed remained pretty much the same, I was over there in San Francisco when the ship came in, and we'd all go out to San Francisco and again have a great time. And one time I had this brilliant idea. I was going to have a party, Berkeley, and I was going to invite my friends from President McKinley, and I was going to invite my Berkeley friends. A big mistake. Big mistake. And that's when I came to realize that these are two different worlds, and somehow they didn't mesh at all. But I kept seeing them as long as they were around. So that was important, and as I said, the union was very important to me. So going to the American Labor Movement, the American Labor Movement I wrote, it's an anthology, which I edited. And I did it for one important reason. I always believed very much in the survey of American history course. Okay. And I wanted to write something that would be used in a survey course that would tell students as dramatically as possible from the original sources why it was necessary for workers to organize into unions. Simple as that. I mean, unions have never had a good reputation, as you all know. I mean, even among our own undergraduates, when I talk about unions, they are not always very receptive. So I wanted them to know, why did workers have to join unions? What were the conditions? And then what did they face once they tried to organize into unions? So that became almost my first book. It came out about the same time as North of Slavery, which focused on, as I indicated, on free blacks in the North before the Civil War. A book in which I found that that racial attitudes in this country were not essentially divided by the Mason-Dixon line. That blacks in the North were severely segregated, miseducated. In most northern states, they did not have the right to vote. They were clearly second-class citizens, and I thought that was an important point to make, because we tend to think of the North as the abolitionist section, and the South as the slave section. So I was curious about what happened. There were 250,000 free blacks in the North in the 1850s, 60s. What was their place in our society? And that's what I tried to explore. So when the book came out in 1961, very interesting, I think, it was applauded in the South, which at that time was caught up in the whole turmoil of the Civil Rights Revolution, and my book came along and they could use it to at least justify their reluctance to move too rapidly and point to the North and say, well, look, it took you some time to adapt. We need that time as well. Not quite what I'd had in mind when I wrote the book, but it was interesting use of the book. But it was well received. I was very pleased elsewhere.
Well, you mentioned your interest in your history book as a high school student, and then the interest in teaching students with the American Labor Movement book, but you've been involved with writing other textbooks, American history textbooks, and just curious if you find that writing experience different than your larger volumes, and how so?
It's certainly very different. Textbook is a textbook, and you could try to write a good textbook, and I think we wrote a good textbook. My collaborator was Winthrop Jordan, who himself is is a fine stylist, and brought that to bear on his section of the book. I got involved in a textbook, frankly, because again, I teach the survey course, and I wanted a book that I would enjoy using in the survey course. The problem sometimes is if you're going to tell stories in the textbook, you can't really tell them in lecture, because they'll say I was reading his textbook. But I enjoyed the textbook because I wanted it to be different, and I wanted this textbook to incorporate those voices that I have been talking to you about. That was critical to me in this textbook. What we did was to take an old textbook, the Richard Hofstadter textbook, and we essentially revised it with each edition, and until it was our own. The painful part of the textbook was actually having to do the revisions. The revisions, but also I was the one who had to bring it up to date, because I did the second half of the textbook. And by the time we got into the 70s and 80s, who wanted to write those chapters? Really difficult chapters. And I finally gave it up in the last edition went out of print last year. And I'm very happy I don't have to work on it anymore.
You also alluded to the third in the trilogy.
I'll just say one more thing.
Sure.
The other thing I want to do about a textbook. For most textbooks, the publishing house hires a photo editor, the person who brings in the photographs. I selected all my photographs, and I selected them very carefully, because I wanted the photographs themselves to be viewed as documents, as very important documents.
It's unusual they let you do that. Yes, you alluded to the third in the trilogy of books that you're currently
yeah.
working on. I wonder if you could give us a little preview of what to expect.
Well, the Trouble in Mind essentially ends, it's called the Age of Jim Crow. Of course, Jim Crow lasts until the 1950s. This volume terminated in around the 1920s. And I would suggest, too, that as far as Jim Crow is concerned, the situation remains fairly static through the 1920s and 1930s. Not as though there aren't things happening, there are. But Jim Crow itself, the system, the mechanisms of Jim Crow remain fairly static during that period. So what I want to do is to pick up the story now in the 1930s, but with the focus on World War II. I mean, here we are involved in a war, again, to make the world safe for democracy, against a power that is, if anything, has taken racism to its ultimate. How can we fight a war against Nazism and racism with the Jim Crow army? How can we fight that kind of a war when we treat black soldiers and black people in general as they were treated during the war? It's a very important time. It's not as though things changed during World War II. The mechanisms of Jim Crow are still there intact at the end of the war. But black consciousness has changed, has been very much affected. And throughout the war, there are challenges to the Jim Crow throughout the South. I mean, there are literally thousands of Rosa Parkses during World War II. Women, men, young people, old people, getting on buses, getting on public transportation, waiting to be removed, or upon first being challenged, remove themselves. But they had taken their position. The very act of sitting in, even if they left immediately, the very act of sitting in gave them gave them a new feeling about what might be possible. So it's an important period, and the black voices are plentiful, and you find sources in the oddest places. I have stacks on my floor about that high of material from the military intelligence, just been released by the National Archives around the 1996. The military intelligence kept close watch on black Americans during World War II. They put out an intelligence report which went to company commanders, maybe company commanders, I'm not sure company commanders, division commanders at least, which was divided into 4 parts. It dealt with the people we had to be careful about and watch during the war because of problems of morale. There's one little section, very short section on Nazis, that is local, domestic Nazis. That was pretty brief. There was a section on labor unions, particularly those who called strikes during the war. There was a section on communists, even though the Soviet Union was an ally. But the biggest section by far was a section on black Americans, or it was called the State of Race Relations, reporting every incident throughout the South and parts of the North as well. Well, it's valuable. I mean, they're reporting black actions and black sentiments, some of which they consider subversive. But they need to report all of this because they want people aware of the problem that we're having with black morale and how do we deal with that problem. So unexpectedly, that's become also a very important source. Generally speaking, they don't editorialize, but every once in a while they make it clear where they stand. For example, every time they cite a black newspaper, including conservative papers like the Pittsburgh Courier or the Chicago Defender, or whatever, every time they cite a black newspaper, they always say in front of it, the incendiary. The incendiary Chicago Defender or Pittsburgh Courier. But it's a very rich source, and there are others like it. And I continue using music. This time I'll use blues. In fact, the lecture I gave down in New Orleans at the D-Day conference, drawn out of this current book, I called it Pearl Harbor Blues. So I'll continue using blues and rhythm and blues. And there are 2 books going. One is the third part of the trilogy, which will come down to 1955. So I could already write the last paragraph. We'll have a certain woman getting on a certain bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and not giving up her seat. And now leave it to Taylor Branch, pick up from there, who's written a marvelous history of the civil rights movement. But I'm also giving the Nathan Huggins lectures at Harvard in December. These are 3 lectures in 3 nights. Nathan Huggins, incidentally, who tragically died about 10 years ago now, was a very, very close friend. We were undergraduates together at Berkeley, and then he went off to Harvard while I stayed here, and we maintained our friendship. He wrote a wonderful book on the Harlem Renaissance that I'm sure some of you are familiar with, and they have this lecture series now named after him, and I feel deeply honored to be able to give those lectures. And there I decided that the first lecture will not repeat Trouble in Mind and Been the Strong So Long, but will look impressionistically at those 2 volumes and give me an opportunity to make any revisions I want to make. That will be the first lecture. The second lecture will focus on World War II, which will be the nucleus then of the 3rd book. And the 3rd lecture will give me the opportunity to look at race relations and black Americans from World War II to yesterday. And I'm looking forward to that. I mean, I've been lecturing along those lines, and I plan to keep up the music. That is because I have found that just as I find blues so important, so critical in looking at the experience of black Southerners and Jim Crow, I find hip-hop also critical in looking at black life in the 1980s and 1990s, and also looking at black disillusionment in the 1980s and 1990s. And hip-hop, incidentally, has been greeted in black communities very much like as the blues was greeted in black communities, very much divided those communities. After all, blues was thought to be the devil's music, thought to be blasphemous. And we, of course, know how reactions both among whites and blacks in regard to hip-hop has changed a great deal. But I've found that I've learned a great deal from it. And I have already used it in some lectures, much to the, I guess, amazement of some of the students in the audience who come up to me afterwards and ask me, who does the research for you on hip-hop? Which I resent very much. I actually enjoy listening to it. But it's interesting sometimes to turn the table on an audience. I lectured to an audience of junior statesmen. These are high school organizations. They had a state meeting at Stanford, and I was asked that question. And then they asked me, what is my favorite hip-hop group? What is my favorite rap group? Well, at that time it happened to be Black Star. And they said, oh, wow, they were very impressed. Well, then I turned the table. I said, now, do you know where that title comes from? Well, there was virtual silence until finally a young black girl raised her hand and she said, Marcus Garvey? I said, yes, you passed the test. Very good. But I find it resonates with young audiences in particular, and as it should. I think my favorite, I think the finest compliment ever paid to me was when I went to, I love going to these out-of-the-way colleges, so I was down in Missouri Southern, and I gave my lecture, and the students, they were very receptive, and the professor asked the students to write a one-page reaction to the lecture. And then she sent me some of them. Oh, they were wonderful. I mean, they were very supportive. But one in particular caught my eye, and that was the best. She said, well, this is one of her C students, but he's really very bright. He just doesn't like to work. He's rather lazy. And he wrote one sentence. He said, anybody who wears a black leather jacket, says motherfucker, and raps is cool. I like that.
I'd like to turn to a different one of your projects. For those who don't know this book, Without Sanctuary, we'll say is not your average coffee table book, although it's been on my coffee table for about the past year. In the New York Review, Larry McMurtry writes, "The busy reviewer, accustomed to speeding right through whatever book the postman drops on the porch, has to throw on the brakes here, as should also the casual buyer of slicked-up photography books. This is a book of horrors, and not all horrors are equal." I was wondering if you could say a little bit about this project, which was not just a book, but also a photography exhibition, and how you got involved, and what you imagined the reading public to do in reaction to this book.
Yes, this was getting in this book was a difficult decision, actually, to make. James Allen he calls himself a rag picker. He goes around picking up various sundry things, and he started picking up photographs of lynchings, postcards. These are all postcards. Postcards that were made at the scene, postcards that were sold, postcards that were sent around the country. Postcards in which people who were part of the lynching mob might write on the other side. I was at what they call a nigger barbecue the other day. That's me. I'm the third from the left in the crowd. What's amazing about the book, in fact, is not so much the lynch bodies. That's bad enough and grueling, but to look at the faces of the people in the crowd. That is really something. Well, he proposed that he found a publisher, Twin Palms Press, that wanted to publish these pictures. He asked me if I would write the historical essay that goes with it, what I called Hellhounds. And at first I had to think about it very seriously. That is, how would this book be greeted? How would it be greeted in the black community? I mean, is this not victimization history carried to its extreme? What would people think of our exploiting these photographs in what some have called a coffee table book? These were all very troublesome questions. But I decided that the material was, and also, incidentally, Twin Palms Press, I had to rethink that too, because Twin Palms Press had done a number of different things, but some of them seemed to be aimed at the sensationalism. Twin Palms Press is a press that publishes Maplethorpe, but that's not what I'm referring to, sensationalism. For example, they did the photographs from the Kinsey archives, the photographs from the Burns Detective Agency archives, really pretty bad stuff to look at. And I didn't know whether that was the right company for this book, but they've also done some better photography books, and so I hope that this one would work out. I decided to go ahead with it because I thought it was important to get this message out and to get these materials out into libraries and out to people as well. So I didn't know what the reaction would be. Now, at the same time as the book came out, they had an exhibit in a gallery in Upper Manhattan, which the New York Times covered. And before we knew it, there were lines outside of this small gallery for blocks, people waiting to get in to see the exhibit. And many, if not most of them, were black people. That already told us something about the impact the book had. Black people deciding that this was a terrible part of their heritage, but they had to face it and confront it in much the same way as Jews would go to the Holocaust Museum. A black father would come one day to see the exhibit, and he'd return the next day with his entire family. In a moment perhaps as moving as any, Stevie Wonder came to see the museum. For those of you who don't know, Stevie Wonder is an R&B singer, and he's also blind. Someone who came with him, took him from photograph to photograph, explained what was in each of the photographs. And Stevie Wonder said he just had to be there. I mean, he had heard about this exhibit. He had to see it in that way and to know its content. I spoke to a group at a bookstore in Los Angeles. It was a black bookstore, and it was was so crowded they moved it, actually moved it to a larger auditorium at USC. And people came in, and these are not academic people. These look to be pretty much working class people. But they all came in clutching this book, wanting to talk about the book, asking questions about the book. The first question, perhaps unexpectedly, was on reparations. So it's had an impact beyond anything we had ever anticipated. It's now in a 4th edition. We wondered if it would ever even sell out the 1st edition, but that's not the point. I'm glad it's selling as well as it is, not because the revenue, but because it's important that the book be out there. But it was the reaction of the black community that really captured my attention, and that was very important to me.
It was interesting looking around at reviews of the book. I found some sort of reader reviewers on the Amazon site, and and I'm paraphrasing here, one of whom basically said, if it weren't for these photos, you wouldn't believe the stories. And in a nice reversal, another that said, essentially, if it weren't for these stories, you wouldn't believe the photos. So, and it goes back to your comment also about having control over the photography in the textbooks. Yeah. Sort of how do photographs and their impact play into the writing, and which do you think ultimately has the bigger impact? Is it the photos that make you believe the stories, or the stories that make you believe the photos?
I think they really interact in such a way that I wouldn't argue for the superiority of one, or the dominance of one or the other. The photos are very important, and the photos, I mean, I could have used lynching photographs certainly in my book, Trouble in Mind. Instead, I wanted photographs of the people whose voices I had used. Not a direct correlation, but well, is there a copy of the?
Yeah.
No, of the Trouble in Mind. They're better in the hardback edition, actually, but the photos are essentially of people, ordinary people, and people who went into a photo gallery to have their photograph taken. So this is how they wanted to be seen. This is how they wanted to be viewed. And the same is true of the cover, which are photographs. A former student of mine, it's wonderful to have so many students because you never know when you're going to hear from them. A former student of mine went to work for the Domestic Peace Corps, and she was in West Virginia, or Tennessee, and came across a sort of abandoned sharecropper's cabin. And she found in there a whole stack of aging studio photographs. She didn't know what to do with them, and she remembered my course, and she said, well, maybe you'll have some use for them. Well, I sure did. They're right on the cover, and that's what I wanted to pick. The photographs, go back to the photographs in the lynching book, again, I would just emphasize how important it is to examine the total photograph. I mean, that the crowds in that photograph are so revealing. I mean, what's pictured there can really, yes, it can numb the senses. It's hard to take. And then what you have to understand is that this was not the work of fiends. This was the work of some of the, quote, best people, unquote. This is not the work of the dregs of Southern society. The people who committed these atrocities, who made up these mobs, who were there on the scene, were people very much like ourselves. They were professional people, in part. They were storekeepers, businessmen, typical group in the society, and God-fearing Christians. Oh yes. Lynchings took place in some of the most churchified communities in the South. And that's what you have to understand as you look at the photographs and read about the lynchings is that these were, you might say, ordinary people who were able to persuade themselves that what they were doing was in the best interests of the race, the best interests of the nation, and who had so dehumanized black people that they could inflict the kind of torture and mutilation that they did. You know, it reminded me of one of the stories of one of the death camps. I'm not sure if it was Auschwitz or not, where the people who worked there, including the Nazi soldiers, were forbidden to use the term people applied to the individuals there. They were called blocks of wood. Blocks of wood. And in many ways, black Southerners had been dehumanized over many years in much the same way.
Not to shift gears too quickly, but we are running out of time, and
Sure.
a question I wanted really to get in, a couple of them. One, who are the historians that you read and that seem to influence your thought?
Present company accepted?
Yes.
Well, the historians I've admired over the years, admired for their content, but also for their style, for how they write, and for the audiences they've reached. That would include Richard Hofstadter, particularly Richard Hofstadter of American political tradition. They would include my own mentor, Kenneth Stamp. Kenneth Stamp in particular of the Peculiar Institution. They would include Edmund Morgan, C. Van Woodward, particularly his Origins of the New South. These are some that come immediately to mind. Of course, the early influences, in terms of historians, the early influences would still be people like Charles Beard. But the ones I've chosen primarily because their impact on me has been both in terms of their writing and in terms of what they have written.
And one last question, then we'll promise to at least leave a few minutes for questions from the audience. In relationship to the reading, any fictionalized accounts of these time periods or fiction writers that you particularly admire?
Oh. Well, the people, of course, who I named in my introduction have been very important to me. Richard Wright, Toni Morrison, Sterling Brown, almost everyone who I mentioned. And not just the writers, but also the photographers, the artists. They've all really informed my work, and I've been very grateful to all of them.
Terrific. We have less than 10 minutes to take questions, and we need to repeat the question up here to pick it up on the mic, so if you could keep them sort of brief and pithy so that we don't misrepresent your question. Yes?
I was interested to hear that you like to recite your text.
Question is, has Professor Litwack ever written a play or thought about it?
I've thought about it. No, I've not written one. I think if I was to write anything, I'd be more interested in writing something like a film script. Film fascinates me, and I've certainly consulted on a large number of films, and I love the process that's involved. And finally, I had to decide at some point that if I couldn't appear in the film, I'd have to be a consultant to the film. But I'll have you know, you might have caught me, or maybe you didn't catch me, but I did have a brief appearance in Ralph Ellison, American Journey. I've been typecast as a redneck. And, in the opening scene of the Invisible Man, the dramatization of Invisible Man, for those who know it, it's the racial initiation scene. I'm one of those in the tux and the big cigar, tormenting the black kids. It's actually a very good film. It's the first time they allowed any dramatization of portions of Invisible Man. But they don't trust me with a line yet. Yes. Oh.
Was your object ever to win the Pulitzer Prize?
The question is, was the goal to win the Pulitzer Prize, and what was the feeling after you did win it?
It's always a goal. And there are even some moments when you really like the sentence you've written, and you'll say, that's a Pulitzer sentence. But you know, so many fine books are passed up with the Pulitzer. I just feel very fortunate to have received the award, and even more so perhaps the Parkman Prize, which is given out by the Society of American Historians, because that one is selected for writing. That is the primary criteria. But the Pulitzer was a very exciting moment, and I wasn't here. I happened to be teaching at the University of Moscow. So the word came from my editor at 4 in the morning, thinking we had another one of those crank calls in Moscow, which happens, and instead it was my editor from Knopf telling me that I had a Pulitzer. And so we immediately went to the refrigerator and pulled out that wonderful Russian champagne and toasted it. And the next day they had a couple of gatherings. The Soviets did, and the embassy had one as well. But my Russian colleagues were very excited, and they said, I said, that's like our Order of Lenin. But it is a very, the way it's I mean, I've been on Pulitzer committees a couple of times, and they're very challenging because you have so many good things to look at, and now fortunately they have runners-up as well, but it's good luck as well.
Towards the latter part of your talk, you mentioned the improved reader.
So the question is
Yeah, good
whether
question.
writing should have rhythm and flow, maybe similar to music.
That's a good question. Well, sometimes the rhythm and flow should be maybe like Bartok. That is, I think the danger of, I think maybe that's what you're alluding to, I think the danger is that you don't want it to be mechanical, so that you have a sort of steady ebb and flow. That's not what I'm after. I just want the sound right to me, and I want it to, and I want to see if it has that kind of continuity that I'm trying to impose on it.
I noticed that much of your work involves collaboration, and yet be able to work with colleagues.
Well,
Sorry, so the question is about collaboration, because you brought in.
well, most of where I've collaborated, it hasn't been a situation in which we're both writing the same book. That is, I've collaborated with people as editors of collections, in which we, both of us, read all the manuscripts that reach us, and then we discuss what we think of the manuscript and how we want to respond. The textbook, again, Winthrop Jordan did the first half of the textbook, and I wrote the second half of the textbook. So I've never really, I think you might mean another kind of collaboration where you're, I don't think I'd be very good at that, no. No.
Yes.
For the first two books in your trilogy, it sounded like you were using documents.
It would be a big switch if I were doing it. I mean, it is a little intimidating. I call myself now a 19th century historian, suddenly working in the middle of the 20th century. And I'm not accustomed to having all these sources, overabundant sources. Fortunately, there are two really outstanding oral history programs that have produced hundreds and hundreds of interviews. I'm going through all of them. I've already been through the entire Duke collection, which was an enormous collection, and I'm also going through the collection at Southern Mississippi. I think these will suffice. I do have a few people that I've been told about who I will contact, I will talk to, but for the most part, I'm going to rely on our marvelous oral history people at those institutions who have done quite a remarkable job.
Why is that? Why would you not go out and interview some of the actual participants in these events?
I think probably to answer your question simply because I haven't done it before, and maybe I feel a bit uncomfortable. Maybe if I tried doing it a few times, I would really get the hang of it. The first interview I've ever conducted was actually, it's in this month's American Heritage magazine. It's an interview with John Hope Franklin. And now that I look at the interview, I say, oh my God, can I have it all over again? Because that was my first experience. And so I came to realize that our oral history is a demanding task. I admire those people who do it so successfully, and we have a number of them right here in this room right now. So maybe I will. Maybe I will change my mind.
Well, your work doesn't seem to lack for that, I have to say.
I'm afraid our time is up. I want to thank Professor Litwack for
Thank
making
you.
my job so easy. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.